Hello, everyone. This is Ali Sierra Tan from thinkinginproductions.com. It's unbelievable what's happening in the Middle East and in Israel. And I wanted to chime in to talk about it based on my insights. I've been meditating on it and thinking about it and praying about it. Is this an important event that's happening? Is this prophetic? Is this going to change the face of the world? Is this going to move things forward towards the coming of the Lord? Is this going to be a blessing ultimately to Israel and to the people living in the region? Thinking about these things, and I want to share some of my research with you. What's fascinating is that 50 years ago, to the day when this war began, October 6th, 50 years ago, there was another war called the Yom Kippur War. There are a lot of similarities, and I find that that war provides us with a bit of a template, a pattern to understand what's happening here and to pierce through it. And I think it is signaling to us that there is something spiritual happening here. The Yom Kippur War happened on an appointed day of the Lord, on the Day of Atonement, on a day set aside by God in his holy calendar for purposes known to God and revealed somewhat to us as well. Historically, we know what the purpose of that day was, but apparently it also has a prophetic fulfillment that is yet to come, because these appointed days do. We saw that in the life of Yeshua, in the life of Jesus, that he activated prophetically the appointed days in the spring. And of course, the one in the summer, the Holy Spirit arrived, Shavuot or Pentecost. So the days of the fall also are prophetic. And so 50 years ago, on the Day of Atonement, two armies, Egypt from the south and Syria from the north, launch a surprise attack. People are fasting. They are in the synagogue. Even people who are not terribly religious go to the synagogue on that Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. The streets are empty. Israel is surprised by this attack. The army is, not as, maybe is a little bit relaxed because of this miraculous victory of 1967, when Jerusalem became part of the Commonwealth of Jewish people after 1900 years. So they're not maybe as vigilant as they need to be, and the enemy walks in and has an initial victory. It's actually quite dire straits, the events of that war. Golda Meir even considers that she may have to bring out the really big guns. But, the events of the war unfold, and you can look it up if you want to get the details of it, and Israel is able to win, and ceasefires are put into place. Now, this war is also happening on an appointed day, and that hasn't happened in 50 years. This war is also a surprise. There is also an initial victory. It also has two fronts. I mean, there's the Hamas coming from the south, from the Gaza Strip, and Hezbollah from the north. They haven't come in yet, but they're threatening that they will. There's similarities here, and the 50 years of distance. 50, is an important number in the Bible. When you look at the cycles of 7, which represent kind of the accomplishing of something, the completion of a cycle, the 7 days of, there's 6 days of work, 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest. It's the day of praising God. It's a holy day where God was praised for the work of creation. So 7 completes the cycle. And sometimes we hear of 49s in the Bible, which is 7 times 7. Really a complete cycle. Something incredible is accomplished. For instance, the 70, there's the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy, if you're familiar with that. It comes to 490 years. So that means that, the fifth 500th year is like the beginning of something new. You have the distance between Passover and Pentecost, Passover and Shavuot. You count 49 days plus 1, and on the 50th day, the Holy Spirit arrived. That's why it's called Pentecost. Penta means 50. So there are these something great is accomplished, and there is, I think, a new cycle, a new beginning. 50 marks that. The year of Jubilee, you look at, for instance, the idea that, on the year of Jubilee, which is the 50th year, inheritance is returned, debt is forgiven, right? There's something very important in the Bible's thinking. So there's a distance of 50 years to the day between two wars that both occurred on appointed days of the Lord. They were both surprise attacks. In both cases, the enemy has an initial victory. There are two fronts, one from the north, one from the south. This one is happening on the appointed day of Sukkot. When you look at the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 14, it talks about actually the establishing of the Messianic kingdom, of the kingdom of Jesus, on the day of Sukkot. It talks about all the nations gathering against Jerusalem. And these nations are called out by God to gather against Jerusalem because they are going to be judged. When you want to judge something, you have to kind of bring it out. Behold, a day of Adonai is coming when your plunder will be divided in your midst. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to war. Then it talks about how the Lord lands on the Mount of Olives. His holy ones, his angels, have come with him because he's the Lord of hosts, of heaven's armies. And then he defeats the nations, the enemies that have come against Jerusalem. And it's very interesting how he does it. It says that the Lord will strike all the people that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. It's very interesting the way that what is being described here. And once the battle is over, it says then all the survivors from all the nations that attacked Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of heaven's armies, and to celebrate Sukkot, this Feast of Tabernacle, one of the appointed days of God, one of the days that God marks on the calendar that he hands down to Moses. He marks these days that have prophetic fulfillment, and they also have, of course, incredible, they're rich with the way they point to the intentions of God, to the works of God, to the Messiah, to the establishing of the covenant of God, to the tale of redemption and restoration, and to the purposes of God as far as what is it that is creating within that redemption and that restoration, which is a kingdom, a royal priesthood, the image bearers of God who will eventually dwell with him in the heavenly Jerusalem and carry out, in the context of this incredibly intimate and loving relationship, to the point where God is a father, carrying out, his instructions for the created order. The earth is the birthplace, the incubation chamber of the sons of God who have a place in the future of the creation. And this has plunged us into essentially a war of angels. And there is something going on here with the plans of God leading history towards this very Feast of Tabernacle. Israel's story begins in Egypt at the Exodus. It really begins at that faithful Passover, some 3,000, perhaps 500, 600 years ago. I lean towards the later dating of the Exodus. Anyhow, so basically, Israel's story begins at Passover, and eventually, which is a historical event that happened at some point, the very first Passover was in the context of the Exodus. And we know the Passover lamb represents the Savior. John the Baptist, John the Immerser, he says, behold, the Lamb of God, and he's a priest. Both of his parents are priests. He's Levi, and he's qualified for looking at the lamb and saying, this lamb is good to be sacrificed. And so the Holy Spirit speaks through a Levi and identifies the Lamb of God. And this is how the ministry of the Lord begins. And so the Passover lamb is the beginning of the story of Israel, this Passover. It's a historical event, and it ends as you go through the cycle of appointed days on the last of the feasts, Sukkot, which is also a historical day where the kingdom of the Messiah begins, the millennial rule of the Lord begins. Then all the survivors from all the nations that attack Jerusalem will go from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate Sukkot. And it says, furthermore, if any nation, if any of the nations on earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of heaven's armies, Adonai Svaot, they will have no rain. And if the Egyptians do not go up and celebrate, they will have no rain. Instead, it talks about instead there will be the plague that the Lord will inflict on the nations that do not go to celebrate Sukkot, and it just finishes with what those plagues would be. So this whole idea that this feast that God institutes has a prophetic fulfillment. The history of Israel goes from Passover to Sukkot, from Exodus to the millennial kingdom, and this arch of movement through these cycles of appointed days, it's a spiral moving forward through time. It is the process of God establishing the Abrahamic covenant, which is a blessing to Israel and the families of the earth, unfolds through all of this, because the Lord, the Messiah, comes and he activates these appointed days and brings them to life in a whole new way, like the turning of the water into wine. Perhaps that was the symbol, of a renewal of some kind. And so when we look at this prophecy of the coming of the Lord and establishing of this kingdom on Sukkot, I find it interesting that the prophecy begins by saying, behold, a day of the Lord is coming when all the nations will gather against Jerusalem. So it does talk about a conflict. So there are patterns that I find are similar to what's happening right now. The city will be captured. It says the city shall be captured. The house is ransacked. That's what the videos are showing us, that they walked in and they began to ransack the houses. By the way, I'm not saying this prophecy is being fulfilled. No, this prophecy is for the end of the age, the very end of the age. This prophecy is the very last moment of the transition of the age of empire to the Messianic kingdom. I'm saying that Hebrew prophetic poetry is designed in a system of pattern. Prophecy is pattern. Chuck Missler used to say, this is how the Bible is written. Often people look for a single fulfillment. For instance, when it says in the Gospel of Matthew, out of Egypt I called my son. And everyone knows, oh, that's about Jesus. And Jesus was called out of Egypt because his parents went down there when he was a kid. And Matthew's referring to that. But if you go look at Matthew's references, you'll never find a single verse that talks about the Messiah being called out of Egypt. It actually is talking about Israel. But in the system of patterns, the Holy Spirit speaking to Matthew understands that this, Abraham went down to Egypt and then came out of it. Israel went down to Egypt and came out of it. And so did the Messiah. There's a pattern here. And finally, it speaks of the Messiah. There's a pattern in this prophecy of Zechariah 14 that I think is matching what is happening right now on this very feast of Sukkot, because that is when they attacked. You see, they attacked during this particular feast, which lasts 7 days, and there's an 8th holy day of convocation, and they attacked on the 7th day of this feast. So it's very interesting. It's a very important day. The houses will be ransacked and the woman ravished. And that's what we're hearing. As horrible as it is, they're going in and they're raping women as young as little girls as young as 9 and 11. It's sick. And this is what they're doing, ransacking homes, raping women. Half the city will be exiled, and now the prophecy continues, because I think it's about Jerusalem, actually. And when it says half the city, well, I'm not saying I think it says, I'll gather all the nations against Jerusalem. So we know for sure it's about Jerusalem. I'm just It says half the city will be exiled, but the remainder of the people will not be cut off. Jerusalem is divided between East and West, and East Jerusalem is mostly Arab Israelis, West Jerusalem is Jews. So perhaps it's the people of East Jerusalem that rise, and we're seeing that as well. We're seeing today, right now, in the context of this war, we're seeing acts of terrorism in East Jerusalem. So there's a lot of similarities I find here. And what happens in this war? Perhaps what happens here, the pattern that we're seeing in this prophecy, is here to comfort us, because the Lord intervenes, defeats these enemies, and establishes his kingdom on earth, and everyone has to come on Sukkot to worship God. It's the beginning of his millennial rule. So there are two wars. This one is happening on this appointed day. 50 years ago, Egypt and Syria attacked on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. So that's interesting, that there are two wars on two appointed days. Now, when was the last time that Israel declared war? Because Israel just declared war 2 days ago. They, activated what they call Article 40 Aleph, which is gives the government, opens their hands. It's an official declaration of war. When was it the last time that the government of Israel declared officially war? 50 years ago, during the Yom Kippur War. So there's a lot of patterns here. And so that war also ended up being a great victory, and it ended the conflicts, the wars with the Arab world. There was, when Israel was formed, all these Arab nations attacked. That was 1948. Then there was another war, a major one, in 1967 with 5 Arab nations. Then 1973, Egypt had a new leader, Syria had a new leader, and maybe they wanted to prove themselves. They attacked. But then, this was during the Day of Atonement. It ended the cycle of attacks from the Arab world. It ceased. Since 1973, there's skirmishes with the Palestinians, but there is no coalition of Arab nations that's ever attacked Israel since 1973. In fact, it led to negotiations with Egypt, and the ceasefire turned in 1979 to an armistice. It's kind of a peace treaty. It's a cold peace. It's not like completely, but it's been quiet since 1979 with Egypt after that peace was signed. And so it ended something. And I think if the pattern is true, that this war that we're experiencing right now, that we're in the midst of, is patterned on the previous one that happened on an appointed day, then perhaps I can project forward into the results and say, this one will end the conflict that Israel has with non-Arab Islamic nations, because they are the ones. What happened in 1979 when Israel signed that treaty of armistice with Egypt? The 1973 war led to the 1979 armistice with the leader of the Arab world, Egypt at that time, the strongest country. What happened is that on that very year, where Egypt was making friends with Israel, a revolution occurred in Iran, an Islamic revolution occurred in Iran, and the king of Iran, called the Shah in Persian, was toppled. And a theocracy, an Islamic religious government, took over. The priests took over the government, to put it maybe in Western terms. And that changed the relationship with Israel, because the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, was an ally of Israel and of the United States. There was a lot of Soviet influence in the Middle East. A lot of these Arab nations had socialist governments, and they were supported by the Soviet Union. And America, in a way, the sphere of American influence in the Middle East was actually the Iranian-Israeli arch of connection. They were the two main allies of the United States. The United States had also signed a deal with the House of Saud with that was around the oil. So the Shah is toppled. And if you look at the Hebrew scriptures, the way that the Old Testament canon is organized in the Hebrew scriptures in the Tanakh, it ends with the decree of the king of Persia, the king Cyrus, concerning Aliyah to Jerusalem, to going up to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. Actually how the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, ends, in the way that the Jewish canon, the Christians reorganized those books and the order of them. But the Jewish canon ends with this positive call of coming to Jerusalem and building the temple of God, because the dwelling of God with man is really the central theme of the Bible, as far as I can see, that the Lord has gone through great lengths to make us dwell with him and to come and dwell with us, and to give us his own spirit, and to invite us into his presence eventually. That's the focal point of this entire story, right? And to come and have a kingdom with us on the earth in person, and eventually to invite us into the temple at the heart of time and space, and to be with him for all ages. So this is how this decree, so the king of Persia's decree, and from the time of Cyrus, I think God blessed the Persians out of all the empires, because they were the only empire that didn't seek to destroy Israel, but blessed Israel to go back and rebuild the temple. And so Persia was able to have central government for 2,500 years. Even today, aspects of Iran's administration at the foundational level, the way that the government and the provinces are organized, runs on the division system that Cyrus created. So there's 2,500 years of central government, and these kings, these dynasty of kings that rules Iran for 2,500 years, they inherit the decree of King Cyrus concerning Israel. But in 1979, when the Islamic theocracy, the clerics of Shia Islam, take over the country, they no longer respect this divine decree. And so in the same year that, as the consequence of the Yom Kippur War, there's peace with the Arab world, or détente, or whatever you want to call it. Peace is not the right word, but ceasefire, no more Arab armies coming in waves and droves, and eventually the signing of an armistice with Egypt, the leader of the Arab world at that time. In that same year, an Islamic government rises in Iran, topples the king, cancels the relationship of Iran with Israel, which is an ancient relationship, and declares war to Israel, and says, Israel has to be erased and destroyed. And at first, no one really pays too much attention to that aspect of their thinking, because there's a lot of internal problems after a revolution. Then there's a war with the neighboring country of Iraq. Saddam Hussein sees that there's an opportunity, there's chaos in Iran, and why doesn't he just grab the oil-rich regions of Iran? And so no one's thinking about, this Islamic government in Iran is going to be a thorn by Israel's side, or challenge security and stability of the world order. No one is thinking this. But then in after 9/11, when Saddam Hussein is removed from Iraq, which is the modern name for Mesopotamia, the gates of Mesopotamia open. There's no guardian anymore in that land. And so the larger power next door, Iran, that's now fully organized and wealthy, and the revolution has been well established since 1979. And these guys have now been able to, at this point, they're running the show. They just pour in and they take over Iraq, because the south of Iraq is the holy sites for the Shias. And Shiism is a brand of Islam practiced mainly in Iran, meaning that the rest of the Muslim world is Sunni. In fact, from the Arab point of view, when an Arab in the Middle East, an Arab-speaking person says Shia, they just mean Persian. It's not like the Protestant or Catholic division of Christianity, where it's based on, like, the interpretation of scripture is different, or the different sects of Judaism from Reform to Orthodox. No. Shia and Sunni in the Middle East, really, Shia just means Persian, because they are the only Shia country in the entire world. There are only pockets of Shia in some countries, and most Sunni countries don't have any Shias in them. In fact, Iran itself was Sunni until the 16th century as a country. So Shiism just means, this sect that rose out of the Persian version of Islam. And so this is kind of what these guys do. They pour out and they take the south of Iraq and the whole really of the Iraq. They control the parliament of Iraq after Saddam Hussein is removed by the United States. They pour into Mesopotamia, and traditionally, when the Persians cross the river Euphrates, they usually form empire. That's the history of Persia. So they pour into Mesopotamia, and from there into Syria, like the Levant, the Fertile Crescent that goes from the south of Iraq into Syria, Turkey, and all the way down to the Mediterranean. They pour into Syria, and they control that country, and there are opportunities. When the revolutions that happened recently, there was a series of protests in the Middle East. And these protests that happened in all the Arab world suddenly, it started. Some people think that it actually started in 2009 in Iran, when people were protesting the election results. And I don't want to get into that because it'll sidetrack us. But then in Tunisia, this guy burned himself. He was a man who couldn't pay his bills, and the security forces still wanted money from him. And that sparked this whole, revolutionary movement in the Middle East that went on for quite some time. And Syria needed help. The leader of Syria needed help to stay in power, and Iran provided that help and continued to basically take over the land of Syria. The Russia controls the air in Syria. Iran controls the land. And they started to bring more and more weapons, and even set up factories to make weapons and units, military units into Syria, all because the focus was Israel. And when you go after Syria into the next country, Lebanon, with its Mediterranean coast, there is the Lebanon is there's a group called the Hezbollah, which was planted there by Iran and continues to receive its funds from Iran. And its purpose essentially is to eventually launch a war against Israel and be an extension, of Iran's power. And in the Arab world started to support the Palestinians less and less after the Day of Atonement War, after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And so the Iranians filled the gap. And from the very beginning, when the revolution happened in Iran, the PLO chief, Yasser Arafat, he came and saw the leader of the revolution in Iran. Maybe I can show you some pictures, might make it more interesting for you. We can maybe Google together a little bit. So Yasser Arafat and sees. Yeah, he came to see the leader of the Iranian Revolution. They gave him this huge welcome. He was the leader. He was a PLO, the leader of this Palestinian movement, and a lot of these, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a very important sect in today's Hamas, which has attacked Israel, is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood among the Palestinian people. And they're connected really to their founder, who was inspired by Hitler, was essentially an Arab Nazi, really. And so there are all these connections that were woven into place between the Islamic Republic and the PLO. And so they came over and they began to give a tremendous amount of money to Hamas and to fund the military efforts of the Gaza Strip. And they even have their own independent militia parked in the Gaza Strip called Islamic Jihad, to whom that completely or takes its orders from them. And so recently, Biden, the president of the United States, he was looking to change the Middle East, and he was like, "Oh, we're going to change the Middle East." And he made an announcement, and the king of Saudi Arabia made an announcement on Fox television, and the prime minister of Israel made an announcement when he made a speech on the United Nations, and he had an interview as well on American television, and he said, "You know what? We're about to unveil a new Middle East." They called it the New Middle East, and the idea was that Saudi Arabia, which is really a very influential country in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, because Mecca and Medina, the two mosques, the holy mosques of the Muslim world, are there, and these guys are the custodians of it. What they do sends vibrations and a tempo into the Islamic world, and if they make normalization with Israel, that would be very important. It would change the psychology of the Islamic world. And suddenly they wanted to normalize with Israel. Why? What was the carrot? The carrot was that the rising power of Iran scared Saudi Arabia. And so they felt threatened by Iran and they wanted American protection. That was the deal. They'll recognize Israel as long as basically if Iran ever attacks Saudi Arabia, American jets will land. That it was kind of, we don't know the details of the deal, but it was said that it was something like Article 5 of NATO, that if Saudi Arabia is under attack, America must intervene. Some version of that. And suddenly this idea of normalization with Israel and this American presence deepened in the Middle East through this pact. This supreme leader of Iran, the current supreme leader of Iran, he came out, and it's this guy here. He came out and he started to make these speeches, and he was like, "No, are you kidding me?" He made a speech. He said, "That's a bad idea. We don't want to, a more American presence in the Middle East." And by the way, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, it can be solved as part of this deal. Saudi Arabia was saying, "Look, we haven't forgotten the Palestinians. We're going to normalize with Israel, but there going to has to be some sort of concession with for the Palestinians." And Israel, Netanyahu said basically that yes, they're talking about that as well. He came out and said there can't be any concession with Israel. The Palestinians need to basically take the entire land. And he really felt threatened by the possibility of this deal falling into place. So next thing you know, as this war begins, and like this article says, Biden's hopes for the Middle East imperiled by eruption of violence. The Hamas attack on Israel could narrow the chances for the president's effort to negotiate a new alignment in the region by normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And if you kind of look at, let's say, this article that just came out that's still being verified by the Wall Street Journal, it just came out, on October 8th, which is yesterday, reports citing Hamas and Hezbollah sources that Islamic Republic of Iran officials helped plan Hamas's Saturday surprise attack on Israel and gave the green light for the assault at a meeting in Beirut last Monday. And you can kind of read the article yourself. It's in the Wall Street Journal, and you can read it, and I'd have to buy it. So it's very interesting, this idea that, wait a second, this attack was very sophisticated, and they knew exactly, what to dismantle so the alarms wouldn't go off. They may have had some satellite imagery of a rave that was happening in the deserts in Israel. They went in and there was 300 kids there. They killed 260 of them on the spot, raped some of the women among the dead bodies, and then killed the woman. So this how did they get in? There was a very sophisticated attack. So the idea is that there was a nation state behind them. And this nation state may have been the Islamic Republic because it's very motivated in destroying Israel. For instance, just a few weeks ago, there was this, rally in Iran. So basically, on the ground, there's this, the chief of staff, General Mohammad Bagher, delivers a speech while soldiers stand in formation over a surface emblazoned with inscriptions, Israel should be erased, and it's written in Persian and in Hebrew. And look at what he says.
حکومت آقایمان و مولایمان امام زمان علیه السلام حکومت صالحان است، اما معنای انتظار چیست؟ معنای انتظار سکون و گوشه‌گیری و صرفاً داشتن احساساتی به علاقه به حضرت ولی عصر نیست. معنای انتظار ایمان، اعتقاد، حرکت جهادی، تلاش خستگی ناپذیر، ایثار، فداکاری و کسب آمادگی است. آن حضرت چگونه نبردی خواهد داشت؟ برابر روایات نبردی سخت با مستکبران، با ظالمان تابون دندان مسلح، و این نبرد نیاز به نیروهای مسلح مقتدر و توانمند، سربازانی مجاهد، مخلص، پرتوان، شجاع و پایه‌کار دارد.
So he's making a speech to the IRGC, which is kind of something that was meant to be the special military of the clerics themselves, like a military within a military. But then they were allowed after the war with Iraq to form corporations, and they went into business, and they also became very wealthy, and they controlled the oil, the gas, banking system, and they just became extremely wealthy on the scale of like on an international scale. And now they both have the weapons and all the big guns. They have all the money, and they support the clerics, and the clerics support them, and they rule the country with an iron fist. And they're expanding into the Middle East with this ideology that he's talking about just on September 28th, a few weeks ago, that basically there's going to be a prophetic war, they believe, between them and Israel that's going to summon down the rightly guided one, this Islamic Messiah, and establish the universalism of Islam over the world. And he says, while we're waiting, he's kind of saying, what should a person do? He says the person should be, working hard in jihadi activities, which just means basically pushing forward the purposes of Islam. And then he ends by saying that when he comes, what will he need? He will need an army that is ready to do his bidding and to fight, the evil in the world and to knock it down. And of course, at that point, he's saying, we are that army, right? So there's this huge ideological pulse that is behind the Islamic Republic. At this point, these ideas have come to the forefront, and this is why they're so motivated. They think Israel is weak, spiritually and morally on a lower ground, and they can come in. And so they are one of the countries, one of the nation states that's believed, that's what this article is saying, from the Wall Street Journal, that is behind this attack. So this is, the supreme leader of Iran wanted to derail Biden's efforts, the peace between Saudi Arabia, or the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the rise of the new Middle East. He wanted to do that. And what's interesting was that the president of the Islamic Republic, so the supreme leader, this guy really is the main character. He makes all the decisions, especially when it comes to foreign policy. But the country has a manager that runs things on a day-to-day basis. And that manager is called the president. It's not like the president of the United States. He's actually a lower ranking person. This is the guy who matches the president of the United States, as far as ranking is concerned, right? But this guy, who is called the president of Iran, and who the world sees as the political figurehead of the Islamic Republic, is really just kind of a manager of internal affairs and a mouthpiece for this man here. And he comes to the United Nations. And now, with hindsight, I find it very interesting because this year, the UN, like he's making this speech on September 19th, the UN assembly, where all the nations came to New York, occurred during the time of the Day of Atonement, another one of the feasts of God. So the 16th of September was the Feast of Trumpets, also known as Rosh Hashanah, and that is the first day of the month of Tishrei, like the Bible says, the first of the seventh month. And then there's a 10-day gap, and 10 days later, which falls on the 25th of September, is the Day of Atonement, which is not only a day of salvation, like you're atoned, your sins are forgiven, but it's also a day of judgment. Judgment is passed. There are sins, and then they're forgiven. And of course, others may be judged for whom there hasn't been atonement. So it's a time of judgment. And even if the Lord does come back on the Feast of Trumpets, like Paul says at the last trump, he may judge the world at Armageddon on the Day of Atonement and then begin his millennial reign on the next feast, which is just the week after, Sukkot, like it says in the book of Zechariah, right? That he will begin his reign on Sukkot. So this is interesting because he comes to New York during these 10 days, going from the first of the seventh month of the biblical calendar, the Rosh Hashanah, to the Day of Atonement. He's there, and it's a time where people are being weighed. That's the tradition among the Jewish people, that it's a time where things are weighed in the scale, and then judgment is handed down on the Day of Atonement. And of course, the hope is that you are forgiven and your name is inscribed in the book of life. One more year in the Jewish thinking, but of course, we who believe in Yeshua know that it's once and for all through the blood of the Lamb. We are written in the book of life of the Lamb. So this whole time where he is there, perhaps judgment was passed over this Islamic Republic while the president was there and he was glorifying his ideas and speaking against Israel. Perhaps the judgment of God did come. Maybe something was weighed in the scales, and now through this war is being carried out. They are one of the nation states fueling this war, and perhaps the same way that the 50 years ago, the Day of Atonement War began the process of the unraveling of the enemies, of the Arab enemies, perhaps this will begin the process of the unraveling of this republic, meaning that the very thing that they want to do to Israel will occur to them, right? Because remember, Abraham had a blessing spoken over him as the covenant holder, a covenant that would, bless, a covenant that would bless Israel and the nations, because God said to Abraham, in you, the families of the earth are going to be blessed. So the Abrahamic covenant has a protection over it. God says that those who bless Abraham will be blessed, and those who curse Abraham will be cursed. So whatever you do to the covenant holders, it kind of, the same happens to you. So if you seek their death, you die, right? So if you seek to destroy and divide them, you're like Rome attacks Jerusalem and scatters the Jewish people. What happens to Rome? It falls and gets scattered into pieces. So what we're seeing here is perhaps this particular government, this particular sovereignty, this authority that's the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has this idea of destroying Israel and sees them as an unholy, unlegitimate, amoral reality, makes the strategic mistakes. Perhaps it's being called out to judgment by God to attack on one of the holy days of God's calendar. Sukkot represents the time in the wilderness where the Jewish people, the tribes of Israel, the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, they walked and there was a tent of meeting, the dwelling of God with man in the middle, and there was a cloud that would appear. And actually, they were organized. Moses tells them how they're supposed to stand by their tribes, which direction. Kind of looks like a cross, actually, if you look at it from a bird's eye point of view. And they're walking in the desert, following this cloud in the tent of meeting. And that's what the appointed day of Sukkot represents historically, that the dwelling of God with man. That's why it is in that feast that the Son of God, who dwells with man, when he returns, begins his rule. And so it demonstrates the providence of God. That's why you build a booth and you go in and you make sure you can see the stars. The hand of God is over you, covering you, protecting you, dwelling with you. It is somehow during this particular appointed day of God that this war just started. And it mirrors a one that started during the another appointed day 50 years ago, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur War of 1973. So perhaps there's a model here that judgment is about to, something evil is going to be removed from the face of this earth. Now, as this whole thing starts to unfold, we get news that even, I think I have it somewhere here, if I can quickly find it for you guys. Oh, what do we have here? So Iran and Sudan now join. Oh, yeah, that's something else. So, oh, here it is. Russian hack. Oh, you're not seeing what I'm seeing. Give me 1 second. I thought I was still in share screen. Okay, so Russian, it says right here, breaking news. Russian hacker group Killnet has hacked the Israeli government website. The Russian hacker group Killnet has expressed support for Hamas and made the following statement about Israel. Now, what is Russia's role in all of this? Because when you look at, no one country, no nation state has come forward and said, yeah, we were behind the Hamas. So maybe there's a coalition of nation states that have organized this. What if the Russians have an involvement as well somewhere in the back? There's this guy, again, it's like take it all with a grain of salt because you really don't know what's going on. But this guy here, Sergei Sumelini here, is suggesting that actually, okay, where was this? Okay, here, watch this. This is Hamas is throwing over a tank a bomb and capturing a tank, and they're doing this with a drone. A drone appears and throws a bomb. And this guy says Russia is clearly behind this. No ally of Hamas except of Russia has experience of using bomb dropping drones against modern battle tanks. Only Russia could train Hamas. Now, the truth is that, Russia's not the only one. Iran also has stolen drone technology. American drones that crashed in Iran used that to create their own drones. And they could have, and they're even selling drones to Russia, so they could have been also part of it. So it doesn't really prove that a drone threw a bomb in a tank, which is something Russia has been doing in Ukraine, that this is necessarily a Russian tactic, therefore Russia is behind it. There was the hackers from Russia that hacked into the Israeli government. Now, of course, the Russian government distances itself from those hackers, saying, look, they're just independent hackers, nothing to do with me. Well, are they independent? We don't know. So could Russia be in the back there? What would be the motives of Russia? Well, you have been cornered. You feel disrespected. You went to take a piece of Ukraine that was Russian speaking. You wanted access to Crimea, where you've had your fleet for 200 years. And then suddenly the other side of the fence thinks this is a great opportunity to make you weaker, to take competitor down. And then there's also this outcry about how could you attack a sovereign state? This is not a 19th century. We have law and order in this world. We don't want to go back to the chaos of the way the world was before World War II, where stronger nations could just, do anything they wanted to. We can't inspire other countries to act like all of these things we all know about. And so Putin gets cornered, and then he thinks to himself, I know, I'm going to teach you a lesson. I have all of this new Islamic friends. I mean, they're not new because if you look at it, there's another pattern here. The Soviet Union gave the weaponry needed for, all of these wars, 1967, 1973, all the wars that the Arabs had against Israel, the weaponry and training came from the Soviet Union. In fact, when the 1973 war happened, the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago on the Day of Atonement, and Egypt and Syria lost, the new president of Egypt, Assad, he not as yes, Assad, what he did is he actually um Sadat, sorry, Assad was the guy in Syria. I was thinking I'm getting tired of thinking some water, but anyways, Sadat, the new leader of Egypt, who he kicked out thousands of Soviet agents that were in Egypt training the Egyptian army, right? There was this connection between the Soviet Union and the enemies of Israel in these previous wars, right? So moving forward today, it's possible that once again Russia has motives that says, okay, you know what? When we now I'm connected to this world, I'll help them. They'll create chaos, and I'll support them. I'll give them, I'll contribute in one way or another. I'll open a second front. You don't want to play ball with me in Ukraine? Okay. Then why don't you deal with this? Here's a fire for you to put out. Here's something that can shake the world's economy. And of course, behind closed doors, he's making the phone calls and saying, guys, you know what? You play ball with me in Ukraine. I'll play ball with you here. He's using, this is a pattern as well that Russia uses what used to be called the third world as a bargaining chip with the advanced industrial nations. It considers itself to be part of that rank in the world system. And sometimes it uses the small players as a bargaining chip to get what it wants for itself before letting go of what it has taken hostage or to create trouble for another great power. I mean, if this thing gets out of hand, I don't know where the price of oil will go. Groceries, gas, there's inflation. So Putin may have had his hand, and he may have a string where he can pull things back, and maybe that's one reason. If aid gets deflected to Israel, Israel needs bullets, needs missiles, needs money, and if America now says, okay, we're going to have to help Israel, what does that do? It drains the money from Ukraine, and that's another advantage. So Putin may have had his own reasons, and for a moment there's an alignment between him and the Islamists who have a different motive. So what I find interesting is that usually when there's these skirmishes with the Palestinians and Hamas and even with Hezbollah, the rest of the world, takes sides and says, do it, don't do it, whatever. But suddenly, in this case, oh yeah, I wanted to show you if I can find this very quickly, I'll show it to you. Let's see. Okay. If I can find it, if I've saved it, I'll show it to you because Belarus comes out and declares itself on the side of Hamas. They just made an official here's a Muslim world must unite against Israel, Erdogan says to Iran's Raisi. And he's the leader of Turkey. So I guess I don't have that. I don't have it here, but basically, let's see if I have it. If we can, Belarus stands with Hamas. Okay, so I don't have it here either, but basically what happens is that Belarus comes out and just during these 2 days and officially makes an official announcement that the government of Belarus stands with Hamas, and Belarus is the closest ally to Russia. That is where Prigozhin went. He was the guy who had a coup against, or had a dispute, an open air dispute with Putin, and he got himself killed. He was in a plane not long ago, and so he goes to Belarus. That's where Putin says, "Okay, go there, and I'll leave you alone." But of course, you don't mess with. They say if you take a shot at the king, you better not miss. So Belarus is what kind of like a mouthpiece to Russia, and they come out and they say, we support Hamas. The leader of Iran comes out and says we support Hamas, and they're part of that bloc. So Russia may be, in fact, also in the back aware of this, that this was going to happen. They were kind of, waiting. And now the supreme leader of Iran said, okay, I don't want this deal with Saudi Arabia. This will make that other block of power more strong. The American, if the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia and the Jews of Israel and the Christians of America, or that's how the Muslim world sees things, unite, then that's going to make it harder for Iran and the Eastern Bloc. So the supreme leader is like, we got to break this. I think now is the time to play our card, and maybe these other people that are with him at the table agree with him, and they go, you're right, this is a good time. We also could take advantage of this. I'm just making this up, you understand, right? I'm not there listening to these guys. I'm just saying it's interesting that it's possible that another one of the nation states, because they're saying this attack is too sophisticated. And when I think about it that way, I see something very different that's happening. Usually when Hamas or Hezbollah, these are militias, attack Israel, it doesn't really concern the rest of the world. But today, suddenly, the president of the United States comes out and says, we are completely supporting, Israel, and says, okay, we're going to send this American destroyer. We're going to send it to Israel. If I can quickly bring it up for you. Yeah. So US is sending aircraft carrier destroyer munitions to help protect Israel's people. America sends one of its most advanced technologically and largest destroyers to the Mediterranean, just outside of Israel, the coast of Israel. Let's listen to this.
She was first to report this move. Courtney, what do we know?
Yeah, that's right, Kate. The Pentagon announcing the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is heading to the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, that includes the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, the Ford, and cruisers and 4 guided missile destroyers. Now, these ships can launch missiles that can hit both targets on the land and be used for air defense. This is a show of support, but also a show of power. The U.S. goal is to deter Hamas and anyone supporting Hamas from further attacks. The
So America, now you have to understand something about Biden's administration. Biden follows the Obama doctrine. The same way that Obama sent a lot of money to Iran, Biden just unfreezed $6.5 billion of the money of the Islamic Republic that was held in Korean banks for oil that had been sold to South Korea, and they couldn't get the money because it was frozen. Also, because of inflation, the Biden presidency has been turning a blind eye to oil exports from Iran. They can't export oil. As part of the sanctions, it's limited, but the amount of oil. But they're exporting oil right now at 4 million barrels a day, which is maximum capacity for Iran. So their coffers are full of money, and this money came from America. The American government just handed $6.5 billion to the Islamic Republic. When you have that much money sitting in, they already had the money to carry it to launch this war, because they supply the missiles and the rockets to Hezbollah, they supply it to Gaza. It's expensive, but having that much money given to you suddenly is going to empower you more. So the same administration that did this and took very much a pro-Islamic Republic stance, the Biden administration and the Obama administration have been very pro-Islamic Republic, suddenly comes out and says, no, we are standing with Israel, and we're going to send a destroyer. We're going to send it all, to the Mediterranean to park outside of Israel. And you think, why would they ever do that? Because usually when Israel has a skirmish just with, let's say, a militia like Hezbollah or Hamas, you don't get to see that. And then the Prime Minister of England comes out and they put the flag of Israel on 24 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's office is, and then they say, you know what, England stands with Israel. And then the Prime Minister of Canada, who is usually very left wing and would be completely not standing for Israel, comes out and says, we stand for Israel. I've spoken to Israel. I can't believe the images that are coming out. And suddenly the powers of the Western world align behind Israel, and Paris, lights up, the Eiffel Tower lights up with the Eiffel Tower lights up with the colors of Israel, and next thing you know, so the Eiffel Tower lights up the color of Israel. They put a Star of David here, and then people gather around and they sing the national anthem. So basically, I think that what I'm saying is that suddenly very important powers are taking a position the same way that on the other side, Belarus and Iran and other countries are suddenly coming out of the woodworks and saying we support Hamas. Suddenly America, Canada, England, France, they go, oh, we support Israel in this one. And then a major naval presence from the United States is sent right there. And Senator Graham Lindsay, he comes out and he says, you know what? If ever Hezbollah attacks from the north, America will strike Iran. America should strike Iran, he says. Suddenly it's like, what's going on? Why would if this is just a skirmish between a militia and Israel, why would Israel declare war, which they haven't done in 50 years, legally bring out and activate their Article 40 LF, like in the day of Yom Kippur? Why is it that all these great powers are getting involved? I can only assume that because they feel that on the other side of the fence, the Islamic world also, Hamas, also has great nation states and powers behind it. And if in the great chess set of the world order, if the powers on this side don't take their place, and those guys have some victories, the scale of power shifts to the Islamic Russian side of the scale, and not on the English and Judeo-Christian side. So there would be kind of like a shifting of the world order. So these guys have to come in, but they wouldn't come in and take these positions unless they felt that the scale had other powers on the other side and they had to even it out. So even though it hasn't been announced, but the actions that I'm seeing is clearly telegraphing that there is bigger and more important nation states behind this one. The Central Bank of Israel announced today that this crisis is like no other before, and that it was going to affect their economy. So they just are right now buying back their own money to support it. So this is there. All of these, there's all these signals coming on the natural side, on the worldly side, and then on the spiritual side, I see that this war is being patterned on the one that happened 50 years ago on an appointed day of God, and that it ties into the patterning of Zechariah 14. And of course, the big question is, and does it tie into the patterning of the great war of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39? And I have a whole video that I made when Russia attacked Ukraine on my site here that you can see about that war. So what's interesting, first of all, some people believe that Ezekiel 38, 39 is about the actual second coming of the Lord and the end of the days. I think that prophecy is pattern, and so I think it's its own war because, first of all, it has all these tribes that are involved, but they're all Japhetite and Hamite. There are no Semitic tribes mentioned. So it looks like the Arabs, it says here, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all its young lions, will say to you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your company to plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and property, to make off with immense spoils? That they seem to be the Semitic people in this prophecy are on the sideline, and that's what happened. There was the Abraham Accords, which is with Semitic people. Then the Arabs of Saudi Arabia felt threatened by Iran, and they were like, "Okay, we'll come into the fold." And the Arabs had already calmed down with their military attacks against Israel since the Day of Atonement War of 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War. So Saudi Arabia is about to come in, and then the leader of Iran, disrupts that by saying no. He outsmarts him and launches a war that basically shelves that idea of normalization. He calls upon essentially the Muslim world as a whole, because the Muslim world reaches into the Russian steppes, like the old stands, whether it's Chechnya, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan has become a bedrock of Islamic militantism since the fall of the Taliban, since the regaining of the country by the Taliban, which happened in 3 days, which was very interesting. So there he calls to that whole world and says, look, are we really going to put up with the fact that the king of Saudi Arabia, the prince of Saudi Arabia, in his eagerness, he's young to build a modern state, he's letting go and normalizing with these guys and normalizing with the West and normalizing with Israel? No, rise and stand behind me. Let's follow the way of holy Islamic war of jihad, and that's more righteous and true, and we'll get rid of Israel and all that stuff. So he ends up disrupting the Semites and their plans. So if this war here, it doesn't involve the Semites, and right now what we're seeing is that this new wave is with the non-Arab Islamic nations. So the war with the Arab Islamic nations ended 50 years ago in the Yom Kippur War. This is a new wave of non-Arab Islamic nations, such as Iran, such as Turkey, such as the stands of the ex-Soviet Union, and maybe some African countries that are coming now to the forefront. So perhaps the fact that this war is on another appointed day and follows a template of the last one, perhaps it's signaling to us that God is now about to turn to remove this dark evil, which is a plague to the people of the region and the world, and no one can deal with it. No politician, no government, no country, even the people of the region, no one can get rid of it. Only God could bring it and summon it out of the woodwork and judge it. And so perhaps he's using Israel, as the means to accomplish this. And the fact that they've attacked on Day of Atonement, on the day of Sukkot, on the appointed day of God, which ties into the prophecy of the establishing of the kingdom at a time where enemies come to Jerusalem, it's signaling to us a pattern, which is God is going to deal with this. God is going to be the one that's going to deliver the victory, judge the nations that have been involved in this. And maybe some of this judgment falls on Biden because he gave the money, essentially. Maybe Russia is involved, behind the scenes, because is Russia really Magog? There's Turkey is willing to go on that side. Turkey plays both sides of the fence. Another reason I think this war is a pattern of the War of Armageddon, but also at the same time has its own fulfillment, is because in chapter 39, it says that the inhabitants of Israel's cities will go out and kindle fires with the weapons, shields and breastplates, bows and arrows, war clubs and spears. They will make fires with them for 7 years. So when these guys come to war against Israel, what happens is that Israel then goes ahead and God defeats them. It says they will come, I will turn you around, drive you along, and lead you up from the extreme north. Will bring you upon the mountains of Israel. I will strike your bow from your left hand, make your arrows drop from your right hand. You will fall in the mountains of Israel, you, all your troops, and the people that are with you. So they come, and they're brought by God to be judged by God, and they come from the north. I think Syria is going to be the battlefield. And did you know there's a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 17, verse 1, that says that Damascus, the capital of Syria, is going to be destroyed and reduced to rubble? Look it up, Isaiah 17, verse 1. It's never been fulfilled in the history of that city. UNESCO says that that's one of the oldest inhabited cities of the world. Damascus, it's a city of biblical times. You read about it in the stories of ancient Israel and its dealings with Damascus. So that city has not been reduced in that way and may have an end time fulfillment. Perhaps that's where the war happens, because look, that's where the IRGC and these guys have set up. Russia has come and put its planes in Latakia, where Assad's family is from. They have been given a warm water port by Assad in the Mediterranean to have a naval base. And in order to be a global power, you need a naval base in a warm water port. And then the Islamic Republic of Iran controls the ground of Syria. So there is a massive Syrian presence, massive presence of Russia and Iran in Syria. And so these guys are they're brought out by God, and then they fall. They fall on these mountains. They're miraculously defeated by God. You see, they're miraculously defeated by God. And they fall, and then their weapons are seized. And for 7 years, Israel uses those weapons as fuel. Maybe there's some light nukes. We know that Russia has light nukes. Maybe they bring some light nukes with them. So Israel uses those for 7 years for fuel. That doesn't sound to me like the kingdom of Christ, like the kingdom of the Messiah. I don't think that we're going to be burning weapons for fuel, but I could be wrong. But that's another reason I feel this is a distinct war, because it has characteristics that I don't associate with the Messianic kingdom. Or it says, when you've buried all the dead bodies, that God's going to kill this. It says in detail that sulfur comes from the sky. It's you got to read it, Ezekiel 38, 39. These armies are defeated. And then it says that if someone walk around, sees a bone that hasn't been buried, they have to put a marker at the it says men will continually set apart to travel through the land and bury the travelers remaining on the face of the land in order to cleanse it. At the end of 7 months, they will make their search. When they travel through the land, if any sees a man's bones, he will set up a sign by it until the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon-Gog. So somehow, the bones, they're going to take 7 months to bury the bones. Again, does that sound like the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus? God comes to establish a utopia, and we're going to go around burying bones in it for 7 months. And if you see a bone that hasn't been buried, you put a marker and call the specialist to come to bury it. So maybe it's radioactive. Again, does that sound like the kingdom of Jesus? No, not to me. So I feel that this prophecy, we may have just entered the beginnings of the fulfillment. Maybe this is the beginning of what becomes the Gog and Magog invasion, you see. And at the end of the prophecy, we are told that God reveals himself to his people. I will never again leave them there. I will never again hide my face from them. For I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, is the declaration of Adonai. And so it says, I will put my glory among the nations. All the nations will see my judgment that I will execute, and my hand that I will lay on them. The house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God. From that day onward, the nation will know that the house of Israel went into exile for their iniquity. So the point is that God is glorified at the end of the story. Israel's eyes awaken more intensely to their God and I assume to their Messiah. And all of these Islamic holy warriors that have risen, maybe they come from everywhere, as far as the Chechnya and everywhere. They all come. They all finally gather together. I'm suggesting that we may be at the beginnings of this. Maybe this is where this is going, and they get defeated. And so both the Muslim population, but also because they're devout people that have been deceived, they kind of go, wait a second. So all this time, God wasn't with us. God was with Israel. And this kind of bankrupts the entire ideology of Islamic militancy and ends that phase of history and becomes a blessing to the people of the region. And many people come to God from that militancy, because if you look at the pattern of Zechariah 14, it says that all those who survived the war against Jerusalem come to worship the king year after year on the Feast of Sukkot. So the survivors, the enemies that come against Jerusalem, become the worshipers in the millennial kingdom. So, there is the disciples of the Lord who get a glorified body and join the government. There are many people who are not disciples, who don't have the immortal body, who are not have a glorified body, that survive the second coming and enter the kingdom nonetheless, and I think continue to procreate for 1,000 years. They die and they're summoned back at the second, the second death. Well, not the second death, but the white throne judgment. They'll be brought back to life for that. But the people who receive the body are going to, the second death won't affect them. They'll just continue to live because they've accepted the bargain of grace. And that's what is open to you right now. One last thing I wanted to show you that came to my mind before I close, if I can quickly find it. So, oh, so basically, a couple of days before Russia, oh, I see. The Jerusalem Post newspaper has been hacked again. Oh, wow. This is the second time. It's interesting to experience it live. So Jerusalem Post newspaper put out, a thing yesterday saying, sorry, we were hacked. And now they're hacked for a second time. I can't go on the server. So what is this article? Basically, on February 22nd, 24th of 2022, a few days before Russia attacks Ukraine. I remember exactly what day Russia attacked Ukraine. Suddenly, out of the blue, the representative of Russia in the United Nations says, you know what? We no longer feel that Jerusalem should be the capital of the Jewish people. It should be shared. And we believe that the Golan Heights should be returned to Syria, which gives Syria a massive strategic advantage over Israel because it's a height, right? And it was taken during the 6-Day War, never returned because Israel doesn't have a peace with Syria. So it's like, why is it that Russia suddenly has a change of heart concerning Israel, right? Concerning Israel. Maybe there's another article I can show you of a website that is Russia UN envoys concern about Israel's plan to expansion. No, this is not that. So why is it? Let's see if there's a video I can show you. No. Yeah, it was an article in the Jerusalem Post. I was just looking at it the other day. It's this article here, right here, this article here. Russia takes issue with Israel's sovereignty in the Golan Heights, as well as its claim to the city of Jerusalem, the article explains. So just before the war, Russia maybe have betrayed something about their spiritual stance. Now, why is all this important? How is it related to the Bible, really? You see, what the Bible tells us is that God has a plan of redemption and restoration for the human race who originally were made in his image, and that he loves intimately. Every aspect of our life and our being is known to God, and he cares about it all, and he cares about our future, our destiny. He created us for a purpose. And then God doesn't do anything, it says in the Bible, other than that which he speaks to his servants, the prophets. So they're kind of headed, God tells us that we're headed towards this utopia, which is the kingdom, the messianic kingdom of Jesus. We're in the messianic age. That's why he's returned to that's why I mean, many things are happening. The Holy Spirit was given to the nations. The eyes of people were opened. Even the fact that Israel is coming back to the land is something that happens in a way as the Messiah beckons it. So I think that even the coming of Israel back to this land is in preparation for the Messianic kingdom. We're in the Messianic age, but we're not in the Messianic kingdom, even though the Lord has received all power and authority and sits at the right hand of God, and he sits on the throne. But the Messianic kingdom is what, Mary said to Gabriel, Gabriel said to Miriam that your son is going to inherit the throne of his father David. This Davidic kingdom, he's going to come to the earth and establish this Messianic kingdom for 1,000 years, we're told in the book of Revelation. And Zechariah 14 says that we're going to have to go to Jerusalem on Sukkot every year and worship him. So this particular blessing of the presence of God with man in this age of peace, the Sabbath of history, this is a utopia, and we're headed towards it according to the Bible. But there is an enemy that wants to thwart these plans and prolong the age of empire and create their own version of reality and even expand the rebellion into the heavens. So this enemy has a vested interest in destroying the character, since nothing happens other than which God spoke through his servants and prophets. Well, through the prophets of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, God created a vision of the future that involves the presence of Israel in this land and these wars, and eventually one against Jerusalem that brings the Prince of Peace into history, as the Lord will return to repel the enemies, because the next enemy is going to be so great in power that Israel can't deal with it, and the Lord himself has to come with heavenly armies, and there are heavenly beings that have fallen that are involved on earth right now behind the nations. That's what I think the UFO phenomenon is pointing to, the angelic portion of this story. And so the Lord will come with the armies of heaven to deal with that. And remember, he's the son of David. He's also a Judean himself. When he enters Israel and suddenly, takes on the fight, he'll suddenly, for a moment, I think people will go, wow, he is a Jew, in that sense, he is, right? So he's the son of God and the son of man. He's the son of David and the son of God. So basically, this blessing that awaits us involves these events. It involves Israel. So I think the enemy is like, if I can destroy Israel, I'll break prophecy, and the blessing will not happen, and the word of God will not come true, God forbid, because of destroy the character that the prophets described this situation about Israel, the land, Jerusalem. I'm going to destroy Israel. None of it can happen anymore and prolong the age of empire. So these great armies are inspired, but not all of these little wars and skirmishes are mentioned in the Bible. But this one, I think, should catch our attention because it's happening on an appointed day, because it is patterned around a war that happened on an appointed day 50 years ago that was very significant, the Yom Kippur War, because, the characters involved, the nations involved, the way the whole world is getting involved and taking sides, and the pattern of the prophecy of Zechariah 14 that speaks of Sukkot, all of these things tells me that this is a war of prophetic importance. And I think we're going to see what the consequences of this war are going to be as we move forward in the days, weeks, and months to come. But ultimately, it'll be a blessing to the people of this world. It'll be a blessing to Israel and to the nations, and something that is, evil and is uprooted and removed. So let's see where this goes. Let's stick with it. I look forward to talking to you next time. If you like the video, don't forget to share, subscribe, put the alert on, and all of that. Have a great day.